morning. Welcome to the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. I'm Kim McClary, President and CEO, and it's my very great pleasure to welcome you to today's program. We are in the process of planning to resume in-person events, perhaps later in the summer. We anticipate this will begin in July or August for our members only. We're so looking forward to seeing you all in person again. In the meantime, we will continue to provide you with a strong lineup of speakers and topics on our live stream platform. Thank you for your continued membership and financial support. For those of you who would like to submit questions to our speakers, there's a control panel on the right-hand side of your screen where you can type in your questions. Our Vice President of Events will be managing your questions during the Q&A portion of today's program. It is now my great pleasure to introduce today's program, The Future of U.S. Engagement with International Institutions and Global Alliances, with Ambassador Nicholas Burns of the Harvard Kennedy School. He is a professor and a former diplomat, and Robert Abernethy, Chairman of the American Standard Development, a longtime board member of Town Hall, the Los Angeles World Affairs Council, and now the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. Bob, thank you again so very much for moderating today. Ambassador, we're so pleased to have you. Let me turn this over to you, Bob. Thank you.
Thank you, Kim. We really appreciate the leadership as president of the World Affairs Council Town Hall that you've given us. We've been excited about the programming that you've been able to provide and accomplish during trying period times of COVID. And it's been my great pleasure and privilege to have been a member of the Los Angeles World Affairs Council for just a little bit over half a century. I hate to think of how long that is. Anyway, Ambassador Burns, we're delighted to have you with us. Thank you for taking time out of a very busy schedule to be with us in California, at least virtually. We are very grateful for the contributions that you've made to America and to all of us as part of America in the diplomatic arena, in the relations of the U.S. with foreign countries. Your emphasis on starting out in Africa and Europe and the Middle East, and we're delighted to have you here with us today. You have had, I think, 25, 26, 27 years, I think, of active service in the diplomacy of the United States, somewhere that length of time. You actually, later in that period of time, became Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs. That's the third most important position in the Department of State. You served all of us as being our rep in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and have been ambassador to Greece and done a whole bunch of other things that have been helpful to all of us and our lives here in California as we have led them. We appreciate all of that. You began your education process by going to high school in Wellesley, and then you went to Boston College, I think, to study economics and international relations. How did you transition from being a student in those days to get the interest to become a career diplomat?
Well, Bob, good morning to you and everyone in Los Angeles. Good afternoon to other people who might be watching this on the East Coast. I'm thrilled to be with you. Los Angeles is truly one of my favorite cities in the United States. I have a lot of friends there, some of whom may even be wasting a perfectly good hour of their time by listening to me today. But you've been a very good friend, Bob, and we share a graduate school, so thank you for moderating this session. I'll just say very briefly, I grew up in Wellesley, Massachusetts, as you say, went to Boston College, studied history there, and then on to Johns Hopkins, which is our common school, where I studied international economics and American foreign policy in Africa. And like so many people, I grew up in the 60s and 70s, but was a teenager in the 70s, was a college student in the 70s. You know, I had been affected very deeply by Vietnam. I was obviously too young to serve, I turned 17 when the war ended for us, but I was affected by it. It came into our family dinner conversations with my World War II parents and my older brothers and sister. It certainly came into our church. I was at a Catholic church, St. James, where we talked about the morality of the war and the efficacy of a war as teenagers. And it was part of our life along with Watergate. I think it was our failure in Vietnam and my 18, 19-year-old by that time judgment that we could do better that prompted me to think about a career in diplomacy. And that was really all I ever wanted to do once I went to college.
You, as you mentioned, went to the Johns Hopkins School of International Studies, which all of us use to call it by its acronym SICE. SICE has more graduates in the world, in the International Monetary Bank, the World Bank, and the IMF than any other institution. How was it that in your career you never drifted toward either of those two institutions, but chose different paths in diplomacy?
Well, one of the things that drew me to SICE after Boston College was the fact that they had an expectation that people should be protean individuals, meaning well-rounded. And all of us had to take economics, international economics. All of us had to focus on one region of the world. I'd done so much in Europe and had lived in Europe twice in high school and college that I figured I should get smarter about another continent. So I chose Africa and I chose American foreign policy. So a lot of my classmates did go into banking or into international economic institutions, the two you mentioned. But I was really focused on diplomacy. I wanted to serve in the State Department. And after SICE, I was lucky enough to get an internship with the State Department at the American Embassy in Nouakchott, Mauritania, which is in the Sahara Desert, West Africa, one of the poorest nations of the world. And this is just at the time when our hostages were being taken in Iran. This is 1980, the summer of 1980, and the autumn, when various countries in the Islamic world were bidding for influence in countries like Mauritania, a Muslim country. I remember the Saudis and Iraqis competing on mosque construction. Mosques are very important, obviously. People also needed food. They didn't have that. They didn't have jobs. And it was a real education for me to leave behind the world of Western Europe and to be in Africa, to be in a Muslim country. I then later went on to Egypt and served in our embassy there for 2 years, and then on to Jerusalem, where I ran our aid program for the Palestinians. So really the formative part of the first part of my career was not in East Asia. It was not in Russia and Europe. It was really the Middle East and West Africa, the Muslim world.
Recently, we've had Secretaries Tillerson and Pompeo. They have made a number of changes in the Department of State. I believe the number of Foreign Service officers and other personnel has shrunk a great deal. Could you comment on what has happened during the 4 years of our last administration in the department and how you view the Biden administration should focus on the department maybe to strengthen it or rebuild it or restructure it?
Bob, I think the State Department and specifically the Foreign Service, the career diplomatic service, in many ways hit rock bottom over the last 4 years. Morale plummeted. We saw the greatest exodus of senior officers, middle grade officers and junior officers that we've had in well over half a century. President Trump tried to cut the budget by 1/3 and 1/4 in successive years. And luckily, fortunately, a group of Republicans and Democrats blocked him in the Congress, which was extraordinarily fortunate. But the Trump administration, at least President Trump, I should say, made clear that the State Department was, in his words, part of the deep state. And he ignored it and ignored the practice of diplomacy. I must say, I don't want to ascribe all the problems of the State Department and Foreign Service to the Trump administration, because for too long, we haven't seen the attention to the diplomatic arm of our government that we saw to the military and the intelligence communities. After 9/11, on 9/11, I was US ambassador to NATO and saw that we prioritized the use of force, and that was appropriate after 9/11. That made sense. We prioritized our intelligence community. Both of them, as you remember, Bob, went through periods of real introspection, our career military and career intelligence, where they had to reform themselves from within after the failure in Vietnam, after the failure of our intelligence on 9/11 and also in the Iraq War in 2003. And I think that the priority of all of our recent presidents have really been more on those two institutions. Now, I serve with the military and the intelligence community, and I stand second to none in my praise for them. I think they'd be the first to tell you we need a much stronger State Department. The State Department is too small. The Foreign Service is about 13,000 men and women. We just simply don't have enough people to staff our 273 embassies and consulates to be a force in Washington and around the world. We don't train well because we don't have a training float. In the military, 15% of all employees are training at any one time. In the State Department, we can't afford that. We don't have the people to staff our missions if we're going to put 15% of them into training. And so it's a budgetary problem, it's a training problem, it's a problem of professionalization, it's a problem of recruitment. We're recruiting young African Americans, young Latinx Americans. We're not retaining them. In the first 10 years, there's a crisis of diversity. I just testified before the House Appropriations Subcommittee in the State Department a couple of weeks ago on this, along with my friend and colleague, Ambassador Gina Abercrombie Winstanley, who's just been appointed the first ever Chief Diversity Officer of the State Department. And so I think that there's a lot of problems. My sense is that President Biden, Vice President Harris, and Secretary Tony Blinken are really focused on this. I had a chance to brief them during the transition. They've taken this problem and I think are trying to correct it strategically. And that means that both Congress and the new administration, I hope, will commit a greater percentage of funds to the State Department. We'll take training seriously. We'll try to increase the size of the Foreign Service. And finally, Bob, I'd say Congress, I hope, will pass a Foreign Service Act. When Congress passes an act to authorize the mission of a cabinet agency, it's to give that cabinet agency strategic direction. Here's what we, Congress, want you to do on behalf of the American people. There hasn't been a Foreign Service Act passed in 41 years since I was a 24-year-old intern in Mauritania in the Sahara Desert in 1980. And there have only been 3 in the last 100 years, just after the First and Second World Wars and in 1980. Given everything that's changed about the world and about us in the last 41 years, I think Congress ought to set that strategic mission for the State Department. All that needs to be fixed. And I haven't even mentioned the problem of politicization of the State Department, the influx of political appointees, which I think has hit crisis numbers. So 2 colleagues of mine, Mark Grossman and Marcy Reese, both former ambassadors, and I combined over the last year in a Harvard Kennedy School project called the American Diplomacy Project. We wrote a report called The Foreign Service for the 21st Century, and I'd be glad to make it available to the LA World Affairs Council to anybody who's interested in reading it.
What is this idea about mid-level career entry into the department?
Well, right now, the only way to get into the Foreign Service is to take it. It's meritocratic, and that's good. It's to take a written exam, then an oral assessment, and then a security clearance, and et cetera. It takes more than a year to get in, and that's done at the junior officer level. So the only way that we produce ambassadors is to start at the junior officer level, and it takes 25, some cases 30, 35 years to become an ambassador. That still should be the backbone of the modern Foreign Service, but Ambassadors Grossman and Reese and I firmly believe that we've also got to have the capacity to take in people who have 10 to 15 years of experience in those issue areas where the State Department just doesn't have the expertise. If you think of the importance of biotechnology, machine learning and artificial intelligence, climate sciences, the State Department needs experts. We don't need thousands, but we do need experts in these areas to negotiate treaties and to be our eyes and ears and to be part of the policymaking process in Washington. And we're simply not producing enough people with those skills. That one of the recommendations, there were 10 of them that we made in our report, was to create a mid-level entry program so we could reach into the private sector, into nonprofits, into the universities, and ask people to serve the United States government maybe in their 40s or 50s, because they have the experience and expertise to give us the capacity that we're currently lacking.
I was asking about the Ukraine, and I had commented on the troops that were positioned in Crimea and in Russia near the Ukraine, and how that had been more than anything other than what was there in 2014. And I surmised that it might be for a bunch of reasons that I wanted you to assess whether any of those you thought were the real reasons. And I mentioned diversion from Navalny, the intimidation of the Ukraine government, the increase in severe the scope of the sphere of influence of the former Soviet socialist recovered republics around there, the problem of dual citizenship and the potential that might lead to justify, invasion in the future, and a couple other reasons. But tell us what you think is going on there, why what's happened has happened, and what's likely to happen in the future.
Well, Bob, as you know, there's a lot of concern that given the fact that Putin has amassed thousands of Russian soldiers just on the Ukraine border, one possibility that he's going to do now what he did in 2014, February, March 2014, and go into Ukraine. He then invaded, occupied, and annexed Crimea, major violation of international law. So one theory is that he's about to intervene. I think that more people believe there's another theory. He's trying to intimidate the Ukrainians and trying to intimidate President Zelensky, who has been going after some of the oligarchs, the favorites of the Russians in Ukraine itself. He may also be testing our government, the United States, and testing the European governments and NATO itself. So I think that what Secretary Blinken did this week, travel to Brussels, stand side by side with the Ukrainians, as well as with the German, French, Italian foreign ministers, Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary General of NATO, warn the Russians that should they invade, there'll be various serious sanctions by the United States and Europe. That was the right thing to do. Just a couple of hours ago, the Biden administration also announced major sanctions, the toughest in a long time on Russia. And that's in response to several things: the SolarWinds hack, largest hack in history, Russia's interference in our election in 2020 as well. So and as you know, President Biden, backing up, talked to Putin last weekend and apparently had a very stiff conversation with him, if you look at the White House readout, about what the Russians may be doing. So I think that the US has done what it can to signal to the Russians that there'll be major repercussions from them, economic, further isolation should they go into Ukraine.
What are those sanctions and how do they work?
Well, I haven't seen the details of the sanctions announced today, but I know that they the Biden administration ordered 10 Russian diplomats to be expelled from the Russian embassy or the Russian diplomatic establishment, including their consulates here in the United States. And there are other economic sanctions announced today that'll have repercussions. They'll prevent the Russians from holding certain accounts here in the United States that will hurt them economically.
You are a professor, and I like to call you Professor Burns. It's an endeared term because both of my late parents were professors. So I have a great deal of respect for professors. So you have a number of students that you're currently shepherding. Some time ago, Ambassador Steve Bosworth came into one of your classes, and that's when he was Dean of Tufts, I think. And he made a remark to the students, the most daunting challenge that you will have, and you interrupted him, and you said, do you mean since the beginning of this nation in 1776? And he said, yes. Go ahead and take it from there. What was that daunting challenge he was referring to, and what was your response to it?
Well, Bob, I should say a word about Ambassador Steve Bosworth, because he was a legendary American ambassador, our ambassador to South Korea, our North Korea negotiator for President Obama. And we just held last week the first Bosworth lecture. I interviewed President Bill Clinton, for whom Steve had worked. Steve passed away 4 years ago, and we wanted to honor him at Harvard. And so we have an annual lecture. But Steve used to come into my class at the end of his career, end of his life. He spent 3 years with us at Harvard at the Kennedy School, and I would have him guest lecture. And he would tell my class on great power politics, he said that the most difficult challenge the United States has ever faced is the rise of China. And I did interrupt him every time. It became kind of a play between us. And I'd say, Ambassador, are you saying that the rise of China and America having to contend with a stronger China as economic, military, technological rival is the greatest challenge we've ever faced? He said, yes. I'd say greater than the revolution, yes. Greater than the Civil War, yes. Greater than the Second World War and the Great Depression, he said, yes. And I would say, Steve, I don't think I agree with you on that. I think the Civil War was the greater challenge, but the fact that you believe it to be so, and I have so much admiration for you, gives us an indication of what we're dealing with. That the Chinese are contesting America really across 4 battlefronts. They're trying to become the strongest military power in the Indo-Pacific. We've been that power since the close of the Second World War. We ought and need to prevent that from happening. The Quad and the development of the Quad is one way to do that. They're certainly contesting us in terms of trade power, and they're violating many rules of the book of the WTO, taking advantage of American companies and American workers. They are very definitely seeking to become the great digital power in the realm of AI and machine learning and quantum sciences and biotech. And fourth, and this is a departure for the modern Chinese leadership, they're seeking to promote an authoritarian system as the way forward for many governments in the world, not just their own government. And that's Xi Jinping's, one of his signature objectives. And so in those 4 areas, if Steve is right, and I believe he was, I certainly believe we are almost in an entirely competitive framework right now with the People's Republic of China. And we're going to have to contest their power and hold our ground. Now, there may be places where we can work with them. John Kerry was in Shanghai this week to work with the Chinese in advance of next week's Earth Day Summit hosted by President Biden. We ought to be working with the Chinese on climate change. We should definitely be working with them if they're willing to be transparent on the coronavirus and on future pandemics and in strengthening the World Health Organization and the World Health System. But I think Steve's remark, I never forgot it. I think I mentioned it to you. I was so struck by the way he framed it strategically. I think it's one way for us to think about just the immense nature of this competition that we're in with China.
Could you tell us, you mentioned the Quad. What is the Quad, and what transpired in the meeting of the Quad this last March?
Well, the Quad is comprised of 4 countries, the United States, Japan, India, and Australia, all of us democracies, 3 of us treaty allies, the US, Japan, and Australia. At least the US has bilateral treaties with them. And the Quad came together really after the tsunami of 2004. In December 2004, the horrible tsunami that wrought so much destruction in Indonesia, Sri Lanka, southern India. And it was those 4 countries, because we had trained together militarily, the Japanese and Americans especially, along with the Australians and Indians, we were the first responders to provide humanitarian assistance through our military network. Arising from that, and this then happened in 2005, 6, 7, 8, when I was Undersecretary of State, we began to put together the Quad for other reasons, to talk about how to strengthen democracies in the Indo-Pacific, how to limit China, the growth of Chinese military power in the Indo-Pacific, how to protect the sea lanes to commercial traffic through the Arabian Sea, the Bay of Bengal, the Strait of Malacca, up into the Western Pacific. And it became a very useful tool. And then it went out of fashion in 2007 and 8 because the new Australian government, then a government led by Kevin Rudd, decided the Chinese would misunderstand it. And so the Australians really, in a sense, walked away from it. I saw that, and I was in Canberra the first week that government took office, and they gave me a cold steer on the Quad. And so the Quad was really dormant until President Trump and Secretary Mike Pompeo resurrected it over the last couple of years. And I certainly give Secretary Pompeo credit for that, along with people working for him. And now you've seen President Biden commit to it fully. So just a month ago, President Biden participated in the first ever Quad meeting at the head of government level with Prime Minister Suga, who, by the way, is arriving in Washington today. He'll be the first visitor to the White House in this administration, Prime Minister Modi and Prime Minister Morrison. And I think the Biden administration is going to make a lot of the Quad. You saw that they started off at that summit a month ago, not on military means, but to say, why don't we work together on a humanitarian basis to combat the coronavirus? And Japan and the United States agreed to help finance expanded vaccine production by India so that India could then export those vaccines to countries in need. I think you'll see the Quad take on that humanitarian dimension. I hope an economic dimension on trade, but certainly in terms of combining our militaries, not to fight China, but to stand up to China and to hold our ground where we need to hold it in places like the South China Sea and the East China Sea, where we ought to be able to enjoy and have to be able to enjoy freedom of transit of our naval and commercial vessels, freedom of airspaces, and making sure that our four militaries are working together as they currently are to be interdependent and integrated so that we can be the strongest military force in the Indo-Pacific, not China.
In early March, the White House issued a 24-page document that was labeled the National Security Strategic Guidance. That gives guidance about democracy and human issue relations. How does that guidance evolve, and how will it help us or hurt us in relating to China, particularly on issues like Hong Kong and Taiwan and other sorts of things like that?
This is a very important document. Normally, the administration would issue a national security strategy report at the end of the calendar year. But I think, President Biden and Jake Sullivan and Tony Blinken very wisely decided, let's issue our own document right now as an interim document so that the world will understand. And most importantly, the American people will understand what our priorities are. And so I think you see the priorities very clearly. The United States under President Biden is prioritizing our alliances. He believes, correctly in my judgment, in fact, all of our presidents, with the exception of President Trump, have believed that we're stronger working in our alliances. NATO, Canada, and 28 European allies, the 3 East Indo-Pacific treaty allies, military allies, Japan, South Korea, Australia, our defense agreements with the Philippines and Thailand, our new strategic defense relationship with India. These alliances and partnerships magnify American power. They're the power differential, NATO, between the United States and Russia, and certainly the power differential between the United States and China. Some of my students put together a chart in the class I was teaching just last month. And if you put China versus the United States on economic, military, technological metrics, the United States is still stronger, but not by a great margin. If you add Japan and Australia and South Korea and add India as a Quad member, then the balance of power in a comparative basis between China and those countries is quite significant. And that gives us a big advantage. So alliances are very important, Bob. Certainly you've heard President Biden talk more about climate change than any previous American president. It's the appointment of John Kerry, the appointment of Gina McCarthy to be the internal coordinator in the White House staff, the commitment through the current American Jobs Program, the infrastructure program, to have a lot of that money go to transformational investments in clean energy here in the United States and to reform our economy to a carbon-free economy by mid-century. That's a priority. And President Biden has also talked a lot more about democracy and democracy promotion than President Trump did. President Biden, from his inaugural speech on, has been saying that the great challenge now is the democratic world being challenged by the authoritarian world, by the self-confidence of Russia, China, by even a NATO ally like Turkey, by Middle East leaders like Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia. And President Biden campaigned on an idea for a democracy summit. He certainly is acting to bring democracies together. And so in that one document, I think you see some priorities that distinguish this administration, make it a very different administration than the one that just passed President Trump's.
Well, speaking of President Trump's administration, you have worked for and advised several Republican leaders, including several Republican presidents. How do you compare and contrast the administration of George H.W. Bush with the administration of Donald Trump?
I think President Trump's administration was an aberration in the sense that they deprioritized alliances, which was a major mistake. They acted in many respects, they believed, I think their theory was, the United States will be stronger unilaterally. I completely reject that based on my own experience in government, based on my teaching. I think the United States, as we've just talked about, is stronger through partnerships and alliances. That administration made no commitment to democracy and to human rights in their foreign policy. So President Trump was silent on the arrest of Alexei Navalny in Russia, silent on the democratic protests in Belarus, silent on Hong Kong, silent on the Uyghurs. And if you believe John Bolton's book, I read every word of it. John Bolton, the National Security Advisor for President Trump, John Bolton says that at a G20 summit in Argentina, President Trump even gave the green light to President Xi Jinping on the Uyghurs, on the subjugation of the Uyghurs. Now, I don't know if that's true, but John Bolton says it's true, which makes it meaningful. And so I think it was very important for when President Biden came in, that he returned to what made us great, if you will. The fact that we are the standard bearer of democracy, that we believe in alliances, that we want to strengthen the moral voice of the United States by being present on human rights concerns, at least having them be a major factor in our foreign policy making. I think this is all to the good. And as a citizen and as someone who supported President Biden in the election, I'm all for it.
Professor, I could continue this conversation between the two of us for hours. It would be interesting, delightful, and I would learn a lot. But we have a number of members that are anxious to ask questions of you. So we need to turn to that. And
Okay.
Jessica is going to handle that function for us. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob.
Thank you so much, Bob. Yes, we have a lot of questions coming in. The first question, how committed is the U.S. to preserving independence for Taiwan?
Well, I think that is becoming one of the dominant issues in Washington these days, what to do about Taiwan. You know that when we normalized our relationship in 1972 and then 1979 fully with the People's Republic, we curtailed and ended our diplomatic relationship with the government of Taiwan. We've since had what one calls in diplomatic parlance unofficial relations. We've had an American Institute of Taiwan, but clearly given China's tendentious attacks on Taiwan, its verbal attacks, the number of naval vessels and overflights that the Chinese have sent into Taiwanese airspace and Taiwanese waters, and given the fact that there's so much admiration for Taiwan around the world for its democracy, for its record on the coronavirus, which is one of the best in the world, for its economic importance, particularly in advanced electronics and semiconductors and other fields. There's a great deal of sympathy for Taiwan. You saw that President Biden asked Senator Chris Dodd and two former Deputy Secretaries of State, Jim Steinberg and Rich Armitage, to go to Taiwan this week. And they're there right now. It's in a private visit, but obviously as a gesture of respect for the authorities in Taiwan. President Trump actually sent the Undersecretary of State for Economic Affairs to Taiwan, the highest level representative we had sent, any American government had sent for decades. And I don't think anyone in Washington is contemplating recognition of Taiwan by the United States, diplomatic recognition, that kind of thing. But certainly the United States ought to be supportive of making sure that Taiwan is free of coercion and intimidation, and free of a potential attack, and that by the People's Republic of China. And that is what has people worried, that China is acting in such a way that that lots of people are concerned that in the next period of time, could be sometime in the next decade. Admiral Davidson said the next 6 years, that Taiwan could come under indirect or direct attack by the People's Republic. One of our obligations under the Taiwan Relations Act of 1972 is to sell defensive weaponry to Taiwan. And most administrations have done that. And I certainly think that's appropriate. Countries like Taiwan ought to be able to live in freedom and of independence. And certainly after what's happened to Hong Kong and the people of Hong Kong just in the last 12 months, where China has acted to smother the rights and freedoms and democratic liberties of the people of Hong Kong, there's now concern that Taiwan could be next. And that concern is well placed, and American voices should be heard on this issue.
Thank you. In view of China's emergence as a peer competitor, should we pursue creating a new alliance like NATO for the Indo-Pacific region? And this person included their name, so it's Jack Siegel, who is a former U.S. Consul General to Central Russia and a big fan of Nick Burns.
I'm a big fan of Jack Siegel, and we're friends, so it's the Mutual Admiration Society. But Jack, thank you for that question. You know, I don't think that it's going to be necessary for the United States to create a NATO collective defense organization, at least at this point in the Indo-Pacific. We have more the hub and spoke system. We have individual military treaty alliances now for many, many decades, more than a half century, with Japan and Australia and South Korea. And these newfound security agreements that I mentioned earlier are security agreements with Philippines and Thailand, but also I think very significantly, the buildup over the last 15 years of a very strong military partnership between India and the United States. It's really started under President George W. Bush. I worked on that relationship for 3 years when I was Undersecretary of State. It was continued by President Obama and by President Trump, who I think did a good job on this, and now by President Biden. And particularly our air-to-air relationship and our naval relationships are very strong, as they should be, as you look at the Arabian Sea to the west of the subcontinent, the Bay of Bengal to the east, and then the Western Pacific. That's where we need to be working with India to defend our interests, our commercial and sovereign legal interests, but also to defend democracies. And that's where India is linking up with Japan and now Australia, thus the Quad coming together. So I think that system of security that we've built, the presence of the American Navy, the American Air Force Base, our troops on the Korean Peninsula and in Japan, our rotational troops in Northern Australia, in Darwin, and also our major base in Guam, Anderson Air Force Base, and our naval facilities throughout that region. I think that is the right way for us to be building a very strong security system in the Indo-Pacific that can deter Chinese aggression and defend our treaty allies, which of course we have to do and want to do.
President Biden has said, in quotes, "We can do this." Can we be competitive? Do we still have it in us to be competitive with China? If not, how do we get it back?
We can certainly be competitive. We have to be competitive. And to be competitive, you have to have self-confidence. And I think that President Biden is giving us back our self-confidence, that the United States has obligations in the world. We're going to meet those obligations. And as the world's leading democracy, we're going to act like it. And we're going to support democracies, both rhetorically and those to which we are aligned in terms of military assistance and military protection in alliances like NATO and like the 3 treaty allies that I mentioned in the Indo-Pacific. And President Biden's been clear about that, his emphasis on democracy promotion, his emphasis on alliances. I think where he's been very effective is also communicating to us, to the American people, we're only going to be strong overseas when we're strong at home. And as a foreign policy person, I think that he's been right to spend the vast majority of his time on what's happening inside the country, on the pandemic and the threat to Americans, the need to speed the vaccine program forward. And the Biden administration has done a really good job on that. I think last Saturday, 4.6 million people were vaccinated in one day. We're now the envy of the world on vaccinations, at least. Dealing with that, dealing with the economic crisis, and needing to refloat the economy in the months ahead, as if, and we hope mercifully, the pandemic ends, dealing with the crisis of racial inequality, given the events in Minnesota this week, both the murder of a young man, but also the George Floyd trial, that crisis very much with us. And given the insurrection on January 6th, I think we need to strengthen ourselves at home first. Part of what President Biden is trying to do, you see that in the negotiations for the new bill, the new jobs bill, is to also say to the Congress and the American people, let's retool our economy. Let's protect our supply chains. Let's engage in direct investments into the most important and competitive technologies and industries that will be the backbone of our economy in the future. And let's give our private sector a fair chance against Chinese competition, which has often been on an unequal playing field as China has tried to tip the scales. I think this, people are calling this industrial policy. I think it's exactly right. And that home front has to be solidified. And a lot of people are saying, and I agree with this, that the best way to compete with China, not the only way, but the best way is to strengthen ourselves at home, strengthen our technology base, that's a California issue, and strengthen our social and economic base at home. I'm convinced of that, which is why I want to see this foreign policy president, this president who has more experience on foreign policy than most of his predecessors. I think it's right that he continues to focus on the 50 states and on the American people here at home.
Thank you. We have several questions coming in on this. So what are your thoughts about the Biden administration's decision to exit Afghanistan?
Gosh, I've been struggling with this all week, as I imagine many of you have. My heart, obviously, is wanting to see the American people and the American government support the people of Afghanistan. I was ambassador to NATO on 9/11. We were hit very, very hard. And all the allies in NATO came to our defense in invoking Article 5. We all went into Afghanistan together. They're all still with us 20 years later. And we've put our heart and soul, a generation of military officers, of intelligence officers, of American diplomats, 3 American administrations, $1.5 trillion, 2,300 Americans have died in Afghanistan, men and women of our armed forces and other government agencies. And I have to say, I think that President Biden has made the right decision. We gave it 2 decades. It's the longest war in American history. There's no reason to think that if we stayed on a conditions basis, meaning we would wait to leave until certain conditions were met either by the Taliban or the Afghan government. We've been on a conditions basis for 20 years, and we haven't seen the profound change that we had hoped for when we went in. And I'm someone who was involved in that policy and visited Afghanistan several times in the early years, the first 4 or 5 years of our venture there. We had high hopes. I think we've done a lot of good things. We've helped millions of women and girls to return to a normal life, to be able to work, to be able to go to school. They couldn't do that under the Taliban. There's a whole generation of Afghans who I think are more hopeful about the future, who are small business owners, who have even created nonprofits that didn't exist in the Taliban time. But at the end of the day, we can't be in places forever. And that old adage that we can't be the world's policeman is actually true. And 2 decades is enough. We have bigger strategic interests trying to limit China and compete with China as our strongest adversary, contain Putin through NATO in Eastern Europe, and build back our home front, build back our own economy here at home. I think President Biden has made the right decision, but it's a tough one because obviously you want the United States to do as much when our troops leave to continue at least to train the Afghan forces. We'll have a standoff ability to focus on counterterrorism against Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State and the Taliban if necessary. It'll be more difficult. It'll be with some risk, but I do think this is the right decision.
What is your advice for a recent graduate who is trying to apply for the Foreign Service and in the process of taking the FSOT?
Take the exam and don't worry about passing or failing. I'm sure you'll pass. I failed the first time I took the Foreign Service exam. I don't have no shame in telling you that. When I was a senior in college, I thought my career aspirations were over, and a very smart professor of mine said, just take the exam again. I did, barely passed, and went into the Foreign Service for a full career. It's a wonderful career. It's a chance to serve our country. It's a chance to make a difference in government. It's a chance to learn languages, see the world, participate in the public arena. It's one of the greatest things. It's certainly the greatest professional thing I've ever done, and I don't regret a single day that I spent in government. So I wish you all the best with this.
The playbook used in 2014 did not deter Russia from taking Crimea. What changes need to be made to the playbook in 2021?
I think you see a more united NATO in sending a common message diplomatically and publicly to the Russian government this past week than you saw in 2014. I think that in that messaging, the European Union countries, the NATO countries, and the US and Canada made it very clear there'll be substantial economic repercussions if the Russians cross that bright red line and invade eastern Ukraine, which is sovereign Ukrainian territory, just as Crimea still is sovereign Ukrainian territory. What we cannot do and should not do is we can't treat Ukraine like a member of NATO. It's not. We have no Article 5 security guarantee to the Ukrainian people. It does not make sense to start a continent-wide conflagration with Russia on this issue. But I think the Russians are hurting enough economically, and they're isolated enough that the warnings this week, I hope, will have given them pause. And so I think that Secretary Blinken has done a really fine job of bringing the Western countries together to send that message. And I think President Biden certainly did it in his phone call with President Putin last week.
Thank you. With the climate change as a priority to President Biden's administration, how do you see the American involvement in the Grand Ethiopian Dam in East Africa with its negative impact on both the ecosystem as well as the population in the downstream countries, Egypt and Sudan?
That's a terrific question, and I have to tell you, I'm not smart enough to answer it. I'm obviously aware of the dam construction by the Ethiopian authorities. I'm aware of the huge rift between Egypt and Ethiopia over the source waters of the Nile, but I just don't know enough about the ecological consequences. I can guess to give a good answer to your very good question. Just a word on climate change, however, I do think the Biden administration is making an historic contribution here, certainly the greatest attempt to reduce our carbon emissions, to put us back into the Paris Climate Change Agreement. And if the jobs bill can go through, we can begin to make transformational investments in our energy infrastructure in the next 20 to 30 years. Can we bring those carbon emissions down to the levels where they need to be in order to avoid the worst aspects of climate damage to all of us and to our kids and to our grandchildren? It's this forward thinking by decades that underwrites this jobs bill that I think is really one of the most important aspects of anything that President Biden's trying to do. And I hope that the Republicans will more than meet him halfway on this, and the Democrats as well, and that Congress can act to support what the president's trying to do, because I think it is the most important thing that we can do as a country.
What is the Biden policy in Africa going to be?
Well, I hope it's going to be a continuation of what we saw under George W. Bush, certainly in President Obama. We didn't see much of a focus on Africa, frankly, from President Trump. But under President George W. Bush, if you look at the impact of PEPFAR, and that was our $30 billion 10-year program, United States government, both parties supporting it to try to bring relief to those suffering from HIV/AIDS, from malaria, from polio, from other infectious diseases. Continuing that effort is going to be very important. The Power Africa effort of the Obama administration on energy transformation. And I think this administration is well placed. If you look at some of the individuals in it who know Africa well, and certainly Linda Thomas-Greenfield, Ambassador Linda Thomas-Greenfield, our ambassador to the UN, is one of the great experts on Africa in the United States. When I was Undersecretary of State, she was the person we always turned to for wisdom on Africa. Samantha Power, who is going to be the director of the U.S. Agency for International Development, is also someone who spent a good deal of time when she was UN ambassador thinking about Africa. I hope we're going to see to build up our priority relationships with Nigeria, with Kenya and East Africa, our troubled relationship now with Ethiopia, given the problems of Tigray. That needs to be built up. You've seen Secretary Blinken spend time on that, certainly with South Africa. I'm thinking now of the larger states that where a lot of the future of Africa is going to be written. But the population of Africa will double the next 40 years. There's going to be a tremendous necessity for job creation, for infrastructure development, lest we see massive migration out of Africa for jobs, and particularly under the threat of climate change as well, towards places like Southern, Western, and Eastern Europe. I think Africa needs a lot of attention from the United States. I hope it's a strategic priority. We haven't talked about Latin America, and I hope that's going to be an area of priority as well.
Still muted, sorry. Do you think the United States and China can partner together in Africa, supporting regional stability and anti-terrorism efforts?
Frankly, I don't know. I don't know because China and Russia spend most of their time at the Security Council in New York trying to block the United States and Britain and France, the other 3 permanent members of the Security Council. And actually, if the 5 powers could work together, if Russia and China could bring themselves, not just to have a negative agenda, but to work with the other 3, a lot of what needs to be done in the short term in Africa is to help in conflict mitigation in places like Ethiopia, but also in the Democratic Republic of Congo, in the Central African Republic, and other places, Libya, where there have been civil conflicts and civil wars. And the Security Council has been neutered and is not at all effective right now because of the divisions among those 5 into 2 groups of those 5 permanent members. I also don't know the answer to that question. I'd put the onus on China because of the Belt Road Initiative. The Belt Road Initiative is enormous in its scale and its ambition, but all too often leads to long-term indebtedness by the recipient countries. I hope what we might see instead is stronger cooperation by the European Union, by Japan, by the United States, the United Kingdom, now out of the EU, to combine forces on infrastructure development on the African continent, in South Asia, in Central Asia, in parts of Southeast Asia, that would in essence compete with the Chinese, but without the long-term indebtedness. So I don't know if we're going to be a partner with China. I think not. I'd rather partner with the democratic countries with which we have a lot more in common.
Thank you so much. This has been a great conversation. I know we're almost at the end of the hour, and thank you for bearing with us through the technical stuff. I'm going to turn this back over to Bob. Thank you, Ambassador Burns.
Thank you.
Make sure he's coming back on here. There he is.
Thank you very much, Professor Nick. You have been a wonderful contributor to Life in America, a great American, and we appreciate everything that you've done for all of us. Godspeed and good luck.
Bob, thank you, and thanks to the Los Angeles World Affairs Council. I look forward to seeing you in person post-pandemic.
Ambassador Burns and Bob, thank you so much. This was such an informative and timely discussion, and I'm so impressed, Ambassador, with the breadth of questions that you could answer, from Afghanistan to China to NATO to the Ukraine. We all learned so much. So thank you so very much. We hope you can come back in person as well. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kim. Bob, thanks so much.
Thanks, Nick. Thanks, Kim.